I kind of want to get into this topic of tricking, and it's even now to
Yeah.
this day. I feel like it's only been somewhat talked about among not action stars, but people who are observing, martial arts nowadays. I mean, you probably won't necessarily see it in like MMA or anything like that. But talk to me about this martial arts form, or I would say it's a relatively new form, or I would even say it's a form. It's more
Hmm.
of a concept of tricking, and
Hmm.
how you guys utilize that at Kama, in terms of you know using it as a form or a concept to
Hmm.
express different martial arts styles.
Yes, yes. So martial arts tricking is a relatively new style, I guess you can call it. It combines martial arts fundamentals with gymnastics and elements of breakdancing and capoeira. And basically, it's a visual spectacle of the most fantastic elements of martial arts, the most spectacular elements of martial arts. So it's characterized by spinning kicks, like people spinning 2.5 times in the air and kicking, people doing backflips, people doing gravity defying stunts, and using that as a as an aerial display of movements. And it's meant to be it's meant to impress an audience, a third party. And it takes the most aesthetically pleasing elements of martial arts and kind of combines it into a new discipline. So it's not meant for fighting, but it does use the fundamentals derived from martial arts, and it's a relatively new thing. So I would say the seeds of it were probably planted as early as the mid '80s, and it started to reach its early progenitor forms in the '90s, and kind of even made some surfaces. Like it kind of surfaced in martial arts films as early as the late '80s and throughout the '90s with films like Mortal Kombat and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but still it was very much in its infancy. I would say tricking really became the first recognizable form of it was probably in the early 2000s, maybe like 2004, 2005. But since then, it's developed a lot, and it's one of those sports where it's so new that you compare the first year versus 20 years later, which is relatively short for a given sport, and the difference is night and day. You can't even recognize it anymore. Um, and it's interesting because it's that new mentality that I just described, one that's willing to shirk tradition in favor of the wow factor, in favor of what pleases the crowd, and it's breaking away from that traditional mindset where martial arts is only used for offense or defense, and now it's like martial arts is used to wow people. And I think a lot of that is owed to the advent of film, martial arts being displayed in martial arts movies, and showing that there's an appetite to see martial arts displayed in a fictional setting, and skills that aren't necessarily used for direct combat in the real world. Like once that became a thing, that once that became a commodity, people start to buy into it. And when there's more investment into it and more people practicing it, it evolves faster and faster, and it becomes something absolutely new. So I think it's one of those things where technology and culture just infused itself into martial arts and created something new.
Got it. Talk to
And
me about.
nowadays,
Oh, go ahead.
you
Sorry.
like, oh yeah, just the last thing. Nowadays, you're starting to see it more in the mainstream. Many of the stunt people, like you have your Marvel movies and your action movies, and stuntmen nowadays are more and more versed in tricking. It's becoming a more standard set of any stuntman's repertoire.
Okay. There is a topic that I do want to transition to, but um, but before that, I wanted to ask, like, for the everyday viewer, right? Because maybe right now, tricking is kind of this nebulous thing, but you know it when you see it, right? What are some of the
Yes.
ways that, let's say, in either a Marvel film or any sort of action film, that you will see a tricking move? Like, what is like a common tricking move that someone will potentially use, that a viewer can say, like,
Okay.
I've seen that move before?
Right. 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 Okay. I'll start simple. You've got your spinning kicks, kicks have been integrated into screen combat or film fighting for a long time. And you've seen it as early as the Jackie Chan. No, you've seen it even earlier than the Jackie Chan days. But the first like pretty modern kicking tricks were probably first done by Jackie Chan and his contemporaries. But nowadays you'll see, like I mentioned, 540, which is kind of like it's like a spinning kick where you kick so fast that you're landing on the foot that you kicked with. You'll see fancy flips and twists used to dodge things. So, for example, Captain America is being shot at with laser beams by some like Ultron bot, right? And then no, he doesn't just duck. He doesn't just dive out of the way. He kicks his foot up into the air and does a full twist, and and like something completely unnecessary, but it looks really great. And if it shows, you just show laser beams barely missing him while he's doing this maneuver, and it really jazzes up the excitement of what's happening. So corkscrews are a big one. Backflips are a big one. Any move where someone's like twisting and upside down, or they're doing kicks, like or they're doing like one-handed flips, or their legs are just coming over them and they're inverting. Like people like to use that to spice up the action, either for offensive movements like kicks and defensive movements like evades. They'll dodge using a butterfly twist or a corkscrew.
Got it. And are these moves like when they're usually taught on set, right? I'm sure there's some level of martial arts training depending on the actor. I believe some
Mm-hmm.
actors probably want to be able to do their own stunts. Some actors, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
use a body double or a stunt double. So I'm curious, like for the actors that choose, and you don't need to list any names, but just for the actors that do choose to learn,
Mm-hmm.
these kinds of tricking stunts, right? Like, roughly how long does it take for them to actually, pick it up, right? Because, you've been doing martial arts for a
Mm-hmm.
really long time. I'm sure it took a while for you to pick it up, but, in a more professional setting, right? Like, how long does it take basically to get the most amount of flash for kind of the least amount of work, right? The most efficient movement.
Right, right, right. So I do think that in tricking you have your moves that I would describe as bang for your buck, meaning the amount of effort it takes to learn the move versus the amount of feedback, positive feedback you get if you can execute it properly. Um, if that ratio is high, there are moves like that. So like a backflip, for example, is very, very impressive to an average audience, but it's actually far from the most advanced trick. That being said, though, tricking is a very niche sport. It's very specialty driven. I would say that it has a high barrier to entry, and it's not easy to learn. Like people who get into tricking, usually they need a pretty decent to above average physical condition and level of dexterity, level of flexibility. And it really just helps if you have a martial arts background or like a dancing background or something that's conducive to what you'd already be doing. So actors who want to do their own stunts, usually they'll get their kicks by doing kicks. They'll do fight choreography, punches. Like it takes a special kind of trainer and a special kind of cinematographer to take somebody who hasn't spent their entire lives learning martial arts to make them look good. But that definitely exists. But when it comes to tricking, usually, you kind of have to leave that to the specialist, which is in many cases going to be the stuntman. But there are some rare occasions. I'll mention Simu Liu by name because it turns out that Simu hails from a very similar community that I hailed from back in Canada. And as it were, when he auditioned for the role of Shang-Chi, he already knew how to do some acrobatic maneuvers. He already knew how to backflip. He already knew how to aerial and do butterfly twist. So it just so happens that people who are in the industry and in the spotlight have already had some background that enables them to do such things. But as far as learning it on the spot, it's a tall order, and you don't see it very often.
Got it. Uh, I wanted to go into that one comment that you mentioned about tricking, being prevalent in the 80s and 90s. You mentioned Mortal Kombat. I mean, even to a
Yeah.
certain degree, you could probably even include Power Rangers, right? To that as
Absolutely.
well. So I'm just curious, like, in what way has it evolved, right? Like what was sort of
Yes.
tricking sort of seen as, right, in the 80s and 90s versus like, with the advent of YouTube, you have now have videos where, people were posting, their tricking movements online, and talk to me about like that sort of like transition from, just seeing it on the TV screen. And I would imagine also that, like for example, like Power Rangers, right? That's filmed in Japan, right? I'm sure they're probably not necessarily looking at like stuff in the West for inspiration in terms of martial arts, right? Like, there's all these things kind of develop kind of on their own islands to a certain degree. So talk to me a little bit about
Right,
that
right.
transition from film to YouTube, right? In terms of the evolution of tricking.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I actually think that one day tricking will be a valid topic of study in academia. I feel like you can actually have college courses based on how tricking evolved because, like a lot of things, I think tricking is actually a result of globalization. Because, like you said, like like the Zero Rangers, Super Sentai, like Power Ranger, what Power Rangers is based off of, those shows in Japan, like they're doing the moves that kind of laid the foundation for tricking. They're doing 540s, they're doing 360 kicks, and I think they actually got that from Jackie Chan's era of filmmakers, where people who did these kinds of stunts in Peking opera and wushu brought that to film, and that was quickly adopted by their neighbors across the sea. And we see that as American consumers. But what makes I think tricking is distinctly American in origin because it was kind of born in the American karate circuit. So like, and that's many thanks to a movie like Karate Kid, where it kind of highlights the growing culture of karate amongst the suburban middle class, white middle class, like with the proliferation of karate schools in these suburban neighborhoods and all these kids, these American kids getting into karate and competing. A circuit was formed, and it came to be known as sport karate. And it was in these sport karate competitions that they decided to take kata, or the forms in karate, and they had their traditional kata competition where they would do traditional forms, traditional patterns of movements, and compete against each other. But to spice it up a little, they invent something called extreme kata, and then suddenly you can mix and match the forms and make it jazz it up a little. And that it was around the 80s when that started to become a thing. And then as the extreme competition starts to heat up, people start spicing up their routines with these aerial maneuvers that a lot of their competitors can't do. And suddenly they have a clear advantage and they win all the tournaments. But it's an arms race. So people start learning these maneuvers, start innovating these maneuvers, and suddenly the competition has bolstered the growth of this new movement called tricking, martial arts tricking. And evolution speeds up, but right now it's still limited to this karate circuit. And then you introduce the advent of internet technology. With YouTube, people are able to post this footage online, and more people see it, and more people are able to replicate it. And they don't need to go to a karate school suddenly to learn it. They're just going into their backyards and replicating what they see in these YouTube videos. And suddenly, with enough hard work, they start getting good at it. And then suddenly you have the birth of an underground culture, and that's the tricking community. And you've got the martial arts end of it, the formal end of it, and then you've got this breed of backyard trickers, and they're starting to meet each other, and they're starting to trade ideas, and they're starting to meet each other physically, not just communicating online. They're having gatherings all around the country, and skill is just increasing. And as this culture, this underground culture develops, suddenly you have things like value systems. Who's popular in the world of tricking? Who's the it person? And it's driven by competition. And that's just what bolstered its growth. That's what took it from this obscure thing that you only see in the movies in the 90s to like this worldwide community that we have today.
Got it. Talk to me about like who, because you mentioned like the whole line of tricking, and I think you did a really good job of explaining how it went from film to YouTube and the explosion of that, watching the backyard trickers. Talk to me a little bit about who are some of the prominent early figures in the YouTube tricking community, just because like I feel like maybe they don't get their just due, right? Because you're gonna
Yeah.
see what you guys do for Martial Club. Now you see much more tricking being prevalent in, or I guess there's a much bigger platform for martial arts skits and stuff like that among, or at least on YouTube. But I want to you know go back, right, and tell me about a little bit about who kind of like the prominent figures were that really kind of laid the
Yeah.
foundation for the YouTube tricking community.
The funny thing is, I think the pioneers of tricking are unsung heroes, not just in the eyes of trickers, but in the eyes of the world. Because the truth is, a lot of their exploits, a lot of their work, their fingerprints are left on all kinds of things that we consume on a regular basis. So, for example, in the first generation of trickers, you have people like Stephen Ho, or you have your Ernie Reyes Jr., or Ernie Reyes Sr. These people who they were in a lot of things that we might martial arts related shows and movies that we might have seen in the 80s and 90s, like Surf Ninja or Three Ninjas or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Mortal Kombat, Power Rangers. Basically, all of them were the original all stars in the karate circuit, in the taekwondo circuit. Like there was a community already brewing. But the thing is, it's a while in the past, so modern trickers might not even know who they are anymore. And they did all of the entertainment in our American martial arts related media, and we only know them as stuntmen. And stuntmen are pretty unsung in the industry, as it were. So it's like unless you were actually invested and you were trying to learn yourself, you probably don't know who they are. And then you go on to people like Manny Brown, Ben Brown, Steve Torada, like all of these people. Most of them have faded into obscurity, but mainly because a lot of them are working anonymously behind the scenes, behind, um, you know, in the shadows of more established actors, because they're acting as stuntmen and stunt choreographers, and their names kind of go unrecognized. And they're far enough in the tricking past that a lot of current trickers don't know who they are, and they're so hidden in the credits that you don't really recognize their name when you see it scroll by. And then we go on to, I would say the closest tricking ever got to mainstream was probably about 10, 15 years ago at this point, when there was a generation led by Anish Churfa. And people might know him as Rinsler from the Tron Legacy movie. And he was also in Max Steel. He was, in my opinion, the GOAT of tricking. There are people who are better than him now, but he's like Michael Jordan. You look back and you just have to like understand what it was like when this person was around. They were like the god of tricking. He and he's still alive. It's just he's much more obscure now. We've gotten to a point where trickers today don't even know who he is. But you watch his videos and you see that he's heads and shoulders above the rest. The quality of his tricks, the expression, the power, the gracefulness. Like he jumped so high and spun so cleanly, kicked so wide that it's no wonder that Hollywood snatched him up. And he made his mark in movies like Tron Legacy, and like I mentioned, Max Steel, and other movies as well, in slightly less like well-known roles. But even he kind of exists in relative obscurity when you kind of compare him to society at large. Most people don't know who he is, and it's kind of a shame that there's so much talent. Like every tricker is serving to push the boundary of that frontier of human ability, and they're like gaining ground every single day, and yet most people don't know who these people are. It's kind of a shame,
Can you
and there's reasons for that, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Can you talk to me about you mentioned, pushing the frontier of human ability, right? Talk
Mhm.
to me about what was it like when uh, a tricker, maybe let's say a prominent tricker, they've achieved something that no one else in the community has ever done before, right? Maybe it's, I
Mhm.
don't know, instead of a
Mhm.
triple, I don't know the exact terminology, but instead of like three spins, a triple, whatever, maybe it's a quad, right? And
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
what was what were some of the barriers or the new things that were being pushed, right? And what was that reaction,
Yeah,
by the community? Now that you have YouTube, right, it became like a badge
yeah,
of fame, right? Like no one has ever done this,
right,
filmed, right? Solidify your
absolutely.
place in YouTube history or tricking history. Now that you have YouTube and you can basically show that to the rest of the world.
Yeah. The interesting thing about tricking is that every trick is so spectacular that at one point it was absolutely groundbreaking the first time it was done. And that's basically every trick. Every trick that was ever done was a new trick, when it was created. So, and competition and innovation is woven into the fabric of tricking. So it's in its nature to constantly escalate and grow. So, excuse me. So, for example, a tornado kick, that's a 360-degree kick. In competition, that would win all the tournaments because not a lot of competitors can do it. But then the next tournament, people have been practicing. So now not only can everybody do 360s, some people can now do 540s where they spin a half turn extra. And then in the next tournament, people unveil the 720, and people are like, "What?" Aesthetically, it's just a whole new dynamic. And then the next tournament, people come with 900s, and then the next 1080s, and then the next 1260s, and eventually you reach the ceiling where it's like, okay, now it's getting to the point where I don't know if the human body can even spin that fast or flip that many times. So one example was the corkscrew. So a corkscrew is kind of like you kick yourself into the air and you do a full turn. So it's like a 360 turn while you're flipping in the air.
Is that basically
And
like a triple axel? Like to use an ice skating analogy, is it something of that vein?
it's kind of like a single axle, if you
Okay.
can think of it that way. Think of yeah. So in fact, the motion is very similar. So you've got your axle in ice skating. A cork is like an inverted axle where you kick up and you turn this way and you still land on your feet. So 360 was the standard for a long time. This was considered an advanced move because not only are you kicking yourself into the air, you're also flipping, and while you're flipping, you're also twisting. So it combines all of the aspects of tricking into one move: kicking, flipping, twisting, and it was considered this absolute innovation, and it's really mesmerizing to watch. But then suddenly, someone practices it enough and gets so good at it that they're able to spin twice, and the whole world is lit on fire because the trickers everywhere are going, "How is this possible?" They kick themselves into the air, they're flipping upside down, and now they're able to spin 720 degrees and still land on their feet. That's impossible. And then for a long time, people like the first person to do a double cork was really, really famous because they're probably the only person in the world who can do it. But then some suddenly the barrier is broken, and then another person learns to do it, and then another person learns to do it, and before too long, it becomes a standard skill. It's a highly revered skill, but a lot of people can do it. So for a long time, it was believed that three spins, you kick yourself into midair, you flip over your head, and you spin three times, that's impossible. But then I remember very specifically in 2009, somebody in Australia did it for the very first time, and it was mind blowing. And it took a while, but suddenly another person got it. And that person was the first person to be able to do it consistently. His name was Michael Guthrie, and he's probably still the best tricker in the world today. Um, and it got to the point where over the years, you have maybe like over the next 3 years, you had maybe another three people who managed to land it once, but still only one person who can basically do it on command. And even to this day, a triple cork is still considered a pretty rare skill, even though you probably have like 100 solid people who can do it. It's still a very special skill because it's just pushing that boundary. It's like very, very high, and the level of difficulty is so high that it comes with a certain amount of consequence just to even attempt it. And that Michael Guthrie, that same guy who kind of broke the triple cork barrier, he was able even to land a quadruple cork. So that boundary has been reached, but it is so tip of the spear that to this day, I'm pretty sure he might be the only one who's ever landed it. And if there's more, it's probably like one or two other people, even to this day. And it's been over 10 years now. But if if I know human history, we'll reach a day one day where this is a common skill.
You know what this whole saga sounds like? It sounds like ice skating
What
and
does
the
it sound?
evolution of jumps, right? Like initially, because I used to
Yeah.
watch ice skating with my mom. It's one of her favorite pastimes, as I'm
Yeah.
sure it is with many moms as well during the Olympics or even leading up to it. And one of
Hmm.
the things is like, doing a triple axel, right? Like used to be like the standard, right? And then now, like 20 years later,
Hmm.
people are doing like trying to do like quadruple axles and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it kind of does remind me a little bit of that as, people have better training. There's, like you said, more competition. Um, well, and
Yeah.
also for ice skating, right? They're judged based off of technique. Like that's the thing that you can control. Like you can get perfect scores for your artistic stuff, but like the way that you get more points is if you do more difficult tricks, right? If you say to the judges like, "Hey, I'm going to
Yeah.
do X, Y, and Z tricks," right, and they have higher point potentials. That's the reason why, like, for ice skating specifically, the
Yeah.
level of power as well as the level of skill has increased, and it's obviously gotten a lot tougher, right, to compete in ice skating.
All right. Right. And that's an interesting one because you're right. It is very much the same story, but ice skating, the competition is so tight, right? There's so many people nipping at your heels, and you're judged in a very objective manner based on whether you fail or succeed. In tricking, as it got further removed from karate competition, more and more people were doing it for fun. So they're still pushing that boundary, minus the pressure of executing because there's no judges to hold them to a certain standard. Whereas in ice skating, like you can do your quad, but if you mess up, it's probably going to hurt your overall score, right? Am
Right.
I right?
Yeah, it'll hurt your overall
Yeah. So
score,
I'm
but
wondering.
I'll say that because you attempted the quad, right? Like you get slightly more points, right? Versus like, oh, if you
Oh,
just did a
yeah.
triple axel, right? Like, and you messed that up, right? Just the level of points, I believe, are a little bit different in terms of how much like you gain from attempting it.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting because like there's a lot of parallels between ice skating and tricking. But there's a reason why ice skating is considered a prestigious sport all around the world, and tricking will probably never be featured in the Olympics. Like they progress in a certain way, and there's even a lot of similarities between the skills. But I think there's I've been talking about this with Andy, with my teammates a lot about why tricking hasn't quite broken into the mainstream. Like I mean, their identity is very much as an underground sport, but so is breakdancing. But breakdancing has mainstream attention all around the world, and I feel like there are a lot of factors that contribute to why tricking hasn't quite reached that status.
I would say it's probably a good thing that tricking is not held to the same standard as ice skating, just
Yeah.
because one, like it has more underground roots to begin with. And correct me if I'm wrong, like when trickers actually have like demonstrations and stuff like that, or I think they're called like meetups and stuff like that. I believe that it's just kind of like trying to do horse, right? Like that's the main form of competition. Like if someone does like a like specific type of move set, how like basically can someone copy it, right? Or one up them, right? It doesn't. I'm guessing it doesn't have to be strictly by
Right.
move, but also like the crowd essentially judges like what was more difficult than I don't know. They judge the difficulty versus having a set of like 10 judges or
Exactly.
whatever.
Right, right, right. Yeah, so tricking like breakdancing, there's gatherings and people meet up. And yeah, yeah, so there is a competition element outside of the formalized karate competition. So what I was saying earlier, like with ice skating, where you're under the scope, you're under the microscope of the judges, right? They're breaking down your technique and judging you based on your execution. That's still a thing in sport karate. And I think as a result, people are going to stick to the skills that they know they can land. Like they might be able to land a triple cork in practice, but unless they're able to do that while also throwing 30 punches and 30 kicks in a routine, they'll probably just choose to do a nice looking variation on a single cork rather than risk it with a triple cork because if they land, they've messed up the whole thing. Whereas in the tricking community, there's your personal practice, your sessions where you try to like get the highest difficulty moves you can. But in gatherings, when you're performing in a battle, There's horse battle, which is more like a game where you try to replicate someone's move and add on to it, and then they have to do the same, and whoever fails gets a letter. But you have battling where you try to just one up each other in kind of like the same way, in the same format that breakdancers compete, where a third party audience, they act as the judge, and sometimes there's actually formal judges judging the presentation and the skill of the tricks. But I feel like in this setting, it's social currency that's at stake, and I think that I guess that contributes to a certain type of growth. So it doesn't do much for the overall appeal of tricking to the world at large,
Right.
but I think it helps foster a certain type of growth internally.
I think it's a good point that you mentioned because, like, if you think about tricking in today in the way that it's viewed today, right, with the advent of
Yeah,
YouTube, someone's going to be filming all of this stuff, right? And if you, it's kind of similar to I think what we talked about, where if someone accomplishes a certain type of trick or breaks a barrier, right, like that social currency, it goes to the world, but it's very much geared towards a specific type of audience, like someone in that tricking community, and
yes,
like you basically get to have your
yeah,
name solidified through a video on a certain timestamp of when the video was uploaded. So I think it
yeah,
sounds like that's kind of like what you were sort of talking about.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, that's absolutely a thing. And what's interesting is tricking is so extreme. It's so on the edge of human ability that I think the human ability to perceive it and appreciate it is actually quite limited. So what I mean here's how I demonstrate that. So the advent of YouTube was major for the evolution of tricking, but now we live in Instagram era, TikTok era, where the attention span is much shorter, and the packaging has to be
Right.
a lot more concise, right? So in Instagram, um, a lot of trickers, they like to throw their best stuff on there. They do a compilation of 30 of their best tricks or 30 of their best combos, and it's like 30 seconds of pure awesomeness, lots of spinning, lots of like 20 doubles, triples, what have you, flips, kicks, all of it. But when there's so much of it, it's kind of like it overwhelms the mind. And somebody who runs across this clip in their random suggested feed, they'll be hooked for like 3 seconds, and they'll go like, "All right, I've seen enough," and they'll just scroll on. Whereas somebody who knows how to take one trick and present it just right with a solid takeoff, a solid execution, and a solid landing, and boom. Sometimes that clip has a better chance of going viral than this compilation where someone showed like the best skills over and over again. So that being said, the best trickers don't necessarily always translate to the most influential. Andy Lee, my teammate, is probably one of the most successful trickers out there in terms of following and traction because he knows how to present his tricks. He doesn't go for like the biggest amount of power. He knows how to put it together in a way that's palatable to the general audience. So his technical level isn't the highest you're going to find. It's very high, but it's nowhere near the highest echelon. He just knows what the audience wants to see, and therefore he's way more successful than like most of your other trickers,
Got it.
which
I
is a
want
fascinating that's a fascinating observation.